I heard her whisper before I even opened my eyes. Soft, delicate, yet laced with something unsettling, something that made the air in the room feel suddenly too thick to breathe. "Daddy," she murmured, her voice barely above the rustling of the curtains. "He's watching me again." I forced myself to sit up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes as I turned toward Lily's small frame silhouetted against the dim glow of the nightlight. She stood at the edge of my bed, her fingers twisted into the fabric of her pajama top, her eyes wide and round, reflecting the pale green glow from the hallway. "Who's watching you, baby?" I asked, my voice still thick with sleep, though the unease was already settling into my spine. Her tiny hand lifted, one trembling finger pointing toward the dark corner of the room, just past the doorframe, toward her bedroom, where shadows pooled unnaturally, thick and heavy, as if the darkness itself had substance. My heart gave a slow, uneasy thud. "The man in the walls," she whispered, barely audible, her breath coming in quick little gasps, as if saying it out loud made it more real. A sharp chill skated down my arms, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature in the house. I swallowed, my rational mind kicking in even as something deeper, something more instinctive, screamed at me to listen. "Sweetheart, it's just a bad dream," I said, keeping my voice light, steady, the way parents are supposed to when comforting a scared child. "There's no one in the walls. It's just the house settling, the pipes making noise." But even as I spoke, I found my gaze drifting to the hallway, to the deep blackness beyond her open bedroom door, where the shadows seemed somehow denser, thicker than they should have been. I could feel it, the oppressive weight of something unseen, something just beyond my field of vision, standing in the silence, watching. I shook it off and stood, scooping her up in my arms, feeling how cold her skin was against mine. I carried her back to her bed, brushing the damp curls from her forehead as she clutched onto my shirt. "He said not to go near the walls," she mumbled against my chest. "He doesn't like when we look at him." A slow, creeping nausea curled in my stomach, but I forced a small chuckle, ignoring the way my own pulse had picked up. "Well, I don't like people watching my daughter while she sleeps," I murmured, pulling the covers up around her. "And I promise, there's no one there." I turned on her bedside lamp, letting the warm light chase away the eerie glow of the hallway, and kissed her forehead before heading back to my own room, shaking my head at how easily a child's imagination could twist the mundane into something terrifying. But then, just as I reached my bedroom door, something clicked inside the walls. A deliberate sound, not the creaking of old wood or the groan of shifting pipes, but a tap, soft, rhythmic, just behind the plaster. I froze, every nerve in my body suddenly on edge, the air around me growing impossibly still. For a moment, I convinced myself it was nothing, an auditory illusion, the house merely protesting against the cool night air. But then it came again. 1, 2, 3 soft knocks. Not random, not accidental. Deliberate. As if something, or someone, was tapping just beneath the surface. The breath I'd been holding escaped in a quiet, controlled exhale. It was just the house. It had to be. Still, as I climbed into bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, the sound echoing inside my skull. And just as my eyelids began to grow heavy, just as I drifted into the fragile space between wakefulness and sleep, I could have sworn, just for a second, that I heard a voice, low and rasping, whispering from inside the walls. "I see you too." I awoke to the sound of scratching, faint yet persistent, like brittle nails dragging along the inside of the walls. The noise slithered through the stillness of the house, threading itself between the hum of the heater and the distant creaks of settling wood. At first, I thought it was part of a fading dream, a ghost of sleep still clinging to my consciousness. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the curtains, I realized it was real. My body tensed, an uneasy weight settling in my gut. The sound wasn't coming from the usual places an old house groans at night. No, this was different. It was deliberate. Something inside the walls was moving. The thought coiled around my spine, sending cold fingers crawling up my back. I held my breath, straining to listen, my heart a slow, heavy thud in my chest. Scratch. 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 It wasn't erratic, nor the aimless scurrying of a rat. It was slow. Purposeful. As if whatever was making it knew I was awake. I sat up, glancing toward Lily's room, her door cracked open just enough for a thin sliver of darkness to bleed into the hallway. For a moment, the thought of getting up, of stepping into that oppressive void beyond my door, made my throat tighten. I didn't want to admit it, not to myself, not to anyone, but I was afraid. There was something deeply wrong with that sound. Something unnatural. Yet, the rational part of my mind screamed at me, demanding logic where there was none. Houses make noise. Pipes expand. Wood shifts. The brain plays tricks when it's late. It had to be one of those things. Had to be. But then, just as I was convincing myself to ignore it, something changed. The scratching stopped, abruptly, unnaturally. And in the silence that followed, a new sound emerged. A whisper. A breathy, distorted murmur so soft I barely caught it, yet it carried through the walls as if it had been waiting for me to listen. My stomach clenched, nausea rising in my throat. I see you. The words didn't come from my room. They came from Lily's. I threw the blankets aside, my feet hitting the floor with a dull thud as I moved faster than my body was ready for. My pulse hammered against my ribs as I pushed open her door, my breath coming in uneven gasps. The nightlight cast a feeble glow, illuminating the pale blue walls, the stuffed animals neatly arranged in a line beside her bed, the tiny rise and fall of her chest as she slept soundly, completely undisturbed. But something was wrong. The air felt thick, tainted by something unseen, something that left an invisible residue against my skin. And then, just as I stepped closer, my bare feet brushing against the soft carpet, I saw it. The closet door. It was open. Just an inch. Just enough for darkness to bleed into the room. Just enough for someone to be standing behind it, watching me. I froze, the hairs on my arms lifting, my entire body screaming at me to move, to shut it, to burn it down if I had to. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Because as I stared, rooted to the spot, I heard it again. A whisper from inside the walls. This time, it was laughing. The air in the room was dense, thick with something unseen, something that felt like it had weight, a presence I couldn't shake, pressing against my chest like a vice. My breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as my eyes locked onto the closet door, its edge barely cracked open, revealing only a sliver of shadow beyond. The laughter had stopped. The whispering had ceased. But the silence it left behind was worse. It was suffocating, unnatural, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move despite the deep-rooted instinct screaming at me to turn and run. My fingers trembled as I reached for the closet door, my skin cold and clammy as if I'd just stepped into a freezer. The closer I got, the more my stomach twisted into knots, a sickening sense of wrongness pooling inside me like lead. I hesitated for only a second before I gritted my teeth and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just Lily's tiny row of dresses hanging neatly, their pastel colors swaying slightly from the force of my pull. The shelves were lined with stuffed animals, a few board games stacked carelessly against the side. My throat was dry, my body still braced for something to lunge at me, to crawl out of the darkness and wrap its fingers around my throat. But there was nothing, nothing except an overwhelming, gut-wrenching feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was still here. Watching. My pulse was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, an erratic drumbeat against the suffocating silence. I exhaled sharply, forcing a laugh, too forced, too hollow, and stepped back, shaking my head at my own paranoia. It was just a nightmare. Just my exhausted mind weaving shadows into threats, turning the quiet creaks of an old house into something sinister. I shut the closet door, making sure it clicked firmly into place, before turning back toward Lily's bed. And then I saw it. The handprint. It was pressed against the inside of the closet door, small, pale, and smeared with something dark. I froze, every muscle in my body locking into place as my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The shape of the fingers, the spread of the palm, it was a child's. But it wasn't Lily's. My daughter's hands were clean, tucked beneath the blanket as she slept, her soft breaths even and undisturbed. So whose hand had touched the inside of the closet door? A sharp chill raced down my spine, and my body moved before my mind could catch up. I lunged forward, ripping open the closet again, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. But it was empty. No small figure lurking in the shadows, no whispering entity shifting between the hanging clothes. Nothing but the sickening realization that whoever, or whatever, had left that handprint had been inside this house long before I ever opened that door. The handprint haunted me. It was burned into my mind, a ghostly imprint of something I could neither explain nor rationalize. I hardly slept that night, my ears tuned to every creak, every shift of the house, every phantom sound that sent my pulse skittering against my ribs. By morning, the logical side of my brain tried to regain control. It had to be Lily's, I told myself. Maybe she had sleepwalked. Maybe, God, maybe I had imagined it in my exhaustion. I forced myself to shake it off, convinced that I was feeding into my own paranoia. That conviction lasted until later that afternoon, when I decided to check the closet again. That's when I found the gap. At first, I thought it was just a warped section of the wall, a place where the paneling didn't quite meet properly. But when I ran my hand over it, my fingers brushed against an unnatural gap, a sliver of empty space where the wall should have been sealed. My stomach twisted as I pressed my fingers against the edge, testing the structure. It shifted. My breath hitched, my pulse a sudden, frantic drumbeat in my ears. With a tentative pull, I felt the entire section of the wall give way, revealing a hidden doorway. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, the darkness inside thick and unyielding, as if it had never been disturbed by light. My fingers fumbled for my phone, the harsh glow of the flashlight spilling into the unknown space, illuminating the dust-choked air. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. The passageway stretched deep, winding into the walls of the house, its surface lined with old, crumbling insulation and graffiti-like scribbles etched into the wood. But it wasn't just markings. There were drawings. Childlike scrawls, jagged and frantic, of faceless figures with long, thin limbs, standing in doorways, looming over beds. And among them, written in shaky, uneven letters, was a phrase that made the room tilt around me: "He lives here. He watches. He waits." My breath shuddered out of me, my mind scrambling for explanations that didn't exist. Someone had been inside these walls. Maybe they still were. And just as the weight of that realization crashed down on me, just as the rational part of my mind screamed at me to seal it back up and forget I ever saw it, something deep inside the passageway shifted. A slow, deliberate movement, accompanied by the faintest scrape of fabric against wood. I wasn't alone. I stood frozen at the entrance of the hidden passage, my breath a jagged whisper in the suffocating silence. The dim glow of my phone's flashlight flickered against the rough wooden walls, casting elongated, shifting shadows that seemed to crawl deeper into the darkness. The space smelled stale, like rotting wood and something else, something faintly organic, a sickly sweet scent that sent a wave of nausea rolling through my gut. My fingers clenched around the phone as I strained to hear beyond the oppressive quiet. And then, just as I was about to convince myself that I had imagined it, I heard it again. A shuffle. A slow, dragging step. Something was moving inside the walls. My body went rigid, every nerve screaming at me to turn and run, to seal the passage and pretend I had never found it. But my feet stayed rooted to the floor, my pulse a hammering echo in my ears. The sound came again, closer this time, a deliberate, measured step, like someone testing the weight of the floor before taking another. My stomach lurched, and my mind scrambled for an explanation, anything that could make sense of what I was hearing. A squatter? A wild animal? But neither of those things explained the drawings. Neither of them explained the words etched into the walls, the ones that spoke of something waiting, something watching. And as the realization settled in my bones like ice, the footsteps stopped, just beyond the reach of my light. My fingers trembled as I angled the flashlight deeper into the passage, my throat tightening as the beam illuminated a section of the floor covered in something dark and smeared. My breath hitched. Footprints. Small, child-sized prints leading away from the entrance, disappearing into the inky depths beyond. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing against my skull, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of something unseen, something listening. And then, just as I forced myself to take a slow step back, something shifted in the shadows, low, hunched, impossibly still. The outline of a figure, barely distinguishable in the dark, crouched just at the edge of my vision, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. My breath stuttered in my throat, my entire body locking in place as an overwhelming, primal terror took hold. It was watching me. And then, before I could move, before I could even think, it lunged forward. I slammed the hidden panel shut, my hands trembling as I stumbled backward, my breath escaping in short, ragged gasps. The moment the wall sealed, the sounds inside intensified. Scratching. Tapping. Whispering. Not a single voice now, but many, overlapping in a discordant hum, their words just beneath the threshold of understanding, a garbled symphony of voices from beyond the walls. My pulse pounded against my skull, a frantic drumbeat as I fought against the overwhelming urge to run, to rip Lily from her bed and flee the house without looking back. But my body refused to move, held captive by the suffocating presence pressing against me from all sides. They knew I had seen them. They knew I had found the passage. And then, the whispering shifted. The chaotic, layered voices dropped to a single, deliberate murmur. Get out. Or she stays forever. The words slithered into my ears like ice, sinking deep into my bones, their meaning settling over me with a weight that stole the air from my lungs. My fingers clenched into fists, my mind scrambling for rationality where none existed. The house was old. The walls were thin. The mind, my mind, was prone to tricks in the dark. But even as I forced those thoughts to the surface, even as I desperately clung to logic, I couldn't ignore the unmistakable truth pressing in on me from all sides. This was not my mind playing tricks. This was not the house settling. This was real. And something inside these walls didn't want me here. A sudden crash from Lily's room snapped me out of my frozen stupor. My body moved before my brain caught up, my feet slamming against the hardwood as I tore down the hall, heart hammering against my ribs. I burst into her room, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. The bedside lamp flickered, casting jagged shadows that twisted and danced along the walls. The closet door was wide open, swaying slightly, as if something had just stepped back into the darkness. Lily lay in her bed, her tiny hands clutching her blanket, her breathing shallow. And then, as I moved closer, she turned to me, her eyes half-lidded, unfocused. Her lips barely parted, the words slipping out in a slow, dreamlike whisper. Daddy, he's inside the walls. Lily's whisper sliced through the thick air, each syllable clinging to the silence like an omen. My stomach lurched, a deep, visceral instinct kicking in. Something was wrong, deeply, horribly wrong. I knelt beside her, my hands gripping her small shoulders, shaking her gently, trying to pull her out of whatever trance-like state she had fallen into. Her skin was cold, her eyelids fluttering as though she were struggling to wake up, trapped in some unseen force's grasp. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. Lily, baby, look at me, I pleaded, my voice barely above a whisper. Her lips parted slightly, her breath coming in slow, shallow waves. And then, just as I thought she was slipping back into consciousness, her small fingers twitched beneath the blanket. Her eyelids lifted halfway, her gaze glassy, distant. And she said, so softly I almost didn't hear it, "He's coming." The bedroom light flickered violently, a buzzing hum rattling from the ceiling as shadows warped and stretched unnaturally along the walls. A sharp, frigid wind blasted through the room, though the windows were closed, sending loose papers swirling to the floor. And then, before I could react, before I could grab her, hold her, do anything, Lily's body suddenly jerked upright, her arms limp at her sides, her head tilting in an unnatural, sluggish motion. My pulse hammered against my skull, panic thick in my throat. "Lily!" I shouted, reaching for her, but the moment my fingers brushed against her skin, the closet door slammed shut with a deafening crack. I twisted around just in time to see the room shudder as if the walls themselves had exhaled. The light above us buzzed again, and then everything went black. Silence. Suffocating, absolute silence. The kind that makes your ears ring, makes your own breath sound too loud. My hands were outstretched in the darkness, feeling blindly for Lily, my fingers meeting nothing but the twisted sheets where she had been just seconds before. "Lily!" I called again, my voice cracking with desperation. I scrambled, reaching frantically, my mind a whirlwind of horror. She was gone. My fingers fumbled toward the closet, my breath uneven, ragged. I yanked at the handle, expecting resistance, but the door swung open effortlessly. And in the faint sliver of hallway light that seeped through the open doorway, I saw something inside, something written on the back wall of the closet, in shaky, erratic letters. My breath hitched, my stomach twisted into knots. "She belongs to him now." A raw, guttural scream clawed its way up my throat, but no sound came out. My legs refused to move, my body frozen in place as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. The words scrawled across the back of the closet, "She belongs to him now," seemed to pulse in the dim light, each letter uneven, scratched into the wood as if by shaking, desperate hands. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, and the overwhelming silence of the house was suffocating, pressing against me with the weight of something unseen. The air smelled stale, tainted with a faint metallic tang, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something else. Tiny, smeared fingerprints trailing down the inside of the closet door. Lily's fingerprints. My stomach twisted violently, nausea rising in my throat. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, my fingers slick with sweat as I fumbled to open the flashlight again. The harsh beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the closet in stark contrast. And that's when I saw it. A hole. Not large, just big enough for a child to crawl through, tucked away in the far corner of the closet. The jagged edges of the wood looked like they had been ripped away from the inside, splintered and uneven. My pulse thundered in my ears, my hands shaking violently as I leaned forward, peering into the narrow, suffocating passage. The air inside was cold, unnaturally cold. And then, deep within the tunnel, I saw something shift. A shadow, impossibly still, watching. Waiting. A breath, too slow, too deliberate, rattled through the confined space, the sound distorted as if it were coming from inside the walls themselves. I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the hole. My body twisted awkwardly as I forced myself through the narrow opening, my shoulders scraping against the rough wood, splinters digging into my arms. The moment I was inside, the air changed. It felt heavier, thicker, like I had stepped into a different place entirely. The space was too small, too tight, and yet it stretched on longer than it should have. My phone's light flickered, the screen distorting, static crawling along the edges. And then, as I crawled deeper, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own breath, I saw something ahead. A figure. Small. Motionless. Lily. She stood with her back to me, facing the far end of the passage, her tiny shoulders rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. Relief flooded me, momentarily overtaking the fear. Lily. I gasped, reaching out to grab her. But the moment my fingers touched her shoulder, she turned. And she wasn't alone. The thing standing behind her wasn't human. It was tall, stretched impossibly thin, its face obscured by the darkness, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. But the worst part, the part that made my lungs seize and my mind scream in protest, was its hand. A long, bony hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder. She blinked up at me, her lips parting ever so slightly, and then, in a voice that wasn't her own, a voice that echoed through the suffocating passage like a distant, distorted recording, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come." The sound of my heartbeat pounded in my ears, so loud it drowned out everything else. My hands, slick with sweat, shook violently as I tried to process what I was seeing. Lily, standing unnaturally still, her eyes vacant, her tiny frame lost in the shadows. And behind her, that thing. A towering silhouette with limbs stretched too long, its presence twisting the air around it into something thick, suffocating, wrong. Its bony fingers rested gently on her shoulder, too gentle, too familiar, as if she had always belonged to it. My stomach twisted violently, every cell in my body screaming for me to grab her and run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come." Her voice was wrong. It wasn't my daughter's voice. It was layered, an echo upon an echo, a discordant mix of something ancient and something that had lived in these walls long before we ever stepped foot in this house. My throat tightened, my mouth opened, but no words came out. Lily's head tilted slightly, her lips curling into a small, unnatural smile. A grin that didn't belong to her. And then, in one horrifying motion, her small hand lifted and pointed behind me. No. Not behind me. At the walls. A slow, grating sound filled the narrow space. I turned, my stomach lurching as my flashlight flickered, and then I saw it. The wood wasn't just wood. It had a face. The grain twisted and rippled, forming the faint outline of a mouth, a pair of hollow, yawning eye sockets, a shape that should have been impossible but was undeniably there. And it was moving. The mouth stretched, curling into something like a smile, revealing jagged, splintered teeth hidden in the knots of the wood. The whispering voices I had heard inside the walls for weeks weren't just voices. They belonged to this thing that was part of the house itself, something that had been waiting, watching. And now, I had seen it. Now, it had seen me too. I lunged for Lily, grabbing her wrist, yanking her away from the figure that loomed behind her, my hands shaking as I clutched her to my chest. But she didn't struggle, didn't react. She only stared, her pupils shrinking to tiny, pinprick dots. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the walls around us began to close in. The passageway behind me sealed itself shut, the wood creaking and groaning, shifting like living flesh, the very structure of the house shuddering. A deep, wet whisper crawled through the space, curling against my ears, slithering into my skull. She was always mine. The face in the wall blinked. And then the walls began to swallow us whole. I clutched Lily against my chest, my fingers digging into her small frame as the walls around us groaned, shifting like something alive. The wooden planks stretched and curled inward, the lines of the grain twisting into grotesque shapes, faces, hands, mouths forming where there should have been nothing but dead timber. The passageway was closing, folding itself into the house, sealing us inside. My breath came in quick, ragged bursts, panic choking me as I turned, desperately searching for a way out. There was none. The walls were no longer just walls. They were swallowing us whole. Lily stirred in my arms, her head lifting slightly, her lips parting in that unnatural, vacant smile. The whispering grew louder, closer, voices slithering into my skull, threading through my thoughts like parasites. You should have left. You should have listened. You should have never come looking. My pulse pounded, my grip tightening around my daughter, but was she still mine? Her body felt too light, her skin too cold. And then, slowly, She tilted her head up to look at me, her pupils swallowing the whites of her eyes, her expression eerily calm. "He's already inside," she whispered. And that's when I felt it. A hand, long, skeletal, brushing against the back of my neck. I whipped around, but there was nothing. Only the wall, solid, unmoving. But I felt it. I felt something slip inside me. A pressure in my skull, a weight in my chest, something coiling behind my ribs. My knees buckled, a searing pain lancing through my spine as my vision darkened at the edges. The whispers turned into laughter, soft and insidious, curling into my ears like a lullaby. My fingers trembled as I reached for Lily, trying to hold on to her, trying to keep her real. But her small hands slipped through mine like mist, her body fading, disintegrating into the very walls that had taken her. She was gone. And I was no longer alone inside my own skin. Darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke up, I was standing in Lily's bedroom, alone. The closet was closed. The walls were silent. My hands hung limp at my sides, my breath slow, mechanical. And then, as I stepped forward, I saw it, the mirror. My reflection stood there, but it was wrong. The smile on my face was too wide. The thing inside me was grinning. My mouth opened, my own voice foreign and distant. "She belongs to me now." And in the walls, from deep inside the house, I heard Lily's voice. "Daddy." Faint. Distant. Forever trapped.